Okay, well, we'll probably have a few more folks walking in and joining us online, but I wanted to thank everyone for coming in on such a gorgeous Tuesday afternoon. I'm Melody Brown-Berkins. I'm the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies in the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, and as many of you who have seen some of our talks before know, one of the things the Institute of Arctic Studies really prides itself on is thinking about the future of scholarship and solutions for the Arctic and our planet that are informed by Arctic knowledge. We really look to the peoples of the Arctic, the knowledge of the Arctic, and don't just think about how we might solve or think about things here on campus, but really reaching out to communities, reaching out to knowledge holders. And you'll hear quite a lot about how this should be done today in the talk. But before we get there, I wanted to first say that we have we're very honored to have the Honorable Bernadette Jordan, Consul General to the U.S. from Canada in Boston with us today, along with her attaché, Michael Pizzaferi. And this is the talk of our 2024 Fulbright Canada Visiting Chair in Arctic Studies. That is a program, just so you know, that we started in 2016 with the establishment of this program. And there's a formal agreement between the Institute of Arctic Studies, Fulbright Canada, and the Dean of the Faculty at Dartmouth that was signed in the Hood Museum in 2016, and we've had 8 Fulbright Canada visiting research chairs here since that time. I won't go through all of them now, but we will hear from Dr. Josée Lavoie in just a moment. But first, the Consul General has so kindly come here to be with us, and I don't think you've been on the job for how long now? 3 months. Excellent, we got her early. And she's telling me, I'm hearing that Dartmouth has shown her its wonderful side today, and she will be back. Actually, maybe to speak, I'm even thinking. Ms. Jordan grew up in the South Shore of Nova Scotia in a small fishing community. She says that her love of her community and her desire to see it grow and thrive started at a very young age when she became a community volunteer while in junior high. She started her work in the field of economic development and built networks. Then moving into community news, spending almost 12 years as a special projects manager for an award-winning newspaper publisher, Lighthouse Publishing, received multiple awards, started looking into volunteering and running campaigns, and served as the president of the Atlantic Canadian Newspapers Association and a member of the board of the Canadian Community Newspapers Association. And if anyone knows newspapers, this is how you learn about communities, you learn about leaders, you learn about politics. So she survived that and kept going to take a new role in fund development with Health Services Foundation of the South Shore, helping the foundation raise millions of dollars for healthcare in her community, and an active member of the fundraising professionals communities, Association of Fundraising Professionals, and won many awards in that. In 2015, she ran for and won, and I learned what this is, the federal riding of South Shore St. Margaret's, that's the district of South Shore St. Margaret's, by the largest margin ever, and became the first woman to hold the seat, first years in government, and was the chair of the Atlantic Liberal Caucus, a member of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women and on the Scrutiny of Regulations, and the chair of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. And she worked on many different pieces of legislation in that role, was appointed parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Democratic Institutions, and in 2019 became the first Minister of Rural Economic Development. Later that same year, she became the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard, and made Bernadette the first woman elected in Nova Scotia to hold a seat at the cabinet table. After leaving politics in 2021, she went back to her funding development roots and accepting a position as National Director of Philanthropy with Shelter Movers, a volunteer-powered charity. And then she and her husband now before taking this role, try to live in the beautiful South Shore. They have 3 children, enjoy the beach and kayaking with their dog. I don't know if the dog's still, I hope the dog's still, yes, dog's still there. And was the recipient of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee Medal for Nova Scotia and for her service to Nova Scotia and Canada. And we just talked about that in her spare time, which I doubt there's much of, she's a fabric artist and a speaker at many events involving women in leadership. And again, we're very lucky to have her come here and give a few remarks for this 2024 Fulbright Canada Visiting Researcher in Arctic Studies at Dartmouth, and then I will be back to introduce Dr. Josée Lavoie.
Thank you, Melody. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege for me to be here with you all today to participate in this very important conversation. I want to honor and acknowledge that we are gathered this evening on the traditional and ancestral land of the Abenaki, the original inhabitants of this land. We pay respect to Indigenous people, past and present, who call New Hampshire home. In particular, I want to thank Dr. Melody Birkins for the gracious invitation, and you are a true friend to Canada. And thank you so much for this grateful partnership that we have formed. I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Lavoie's presentation, and it fills me with pride to see such distinguished Canadian researchers like you represented in institutions like Dartmouth. So thank you so much for your work. I began my time as Canada's Consul General in Boston in January of this year. But Arctic policy and work with Indigenous peoples is not new to me. Prior to my appointment as Canada's Consul General in Boston, I served the government as the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard. As Minister, I had the distinct privilege to visit many of Canada's Arctic communities and learn more about what the Arctic means for thousands of people who live in the North. The Arctic is fundamental to Canada's national identity and is home to many Canadians, including Indigenous peoples across the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. The Arctic is embedded in Canadian history and culture and in the Canadian soul. In fact, the Arctic compromises more than 40% of Canada's territory and 75% of Canada's national coastlines. Over 50% of the population living in Canada's Arctic is Indigenous. And it's fitting, therefore, that at the core of Canada's Arctic priorities as laid out in the 2019 Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, it was co-developed with the provinces and territories and Indigenous partners. It's our commitment to work closely with Northern Indigenous peoples on decisions affecting their safety, their cultural well-being, and their livelihoods. Canada prioritizes this engagement and consultation with Indigenous people in its foreign policy as well. Just last week, I was honored to welcome to Boston the Scientific Committee on the Agreement to Prevent Unregulated High Seas Fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. The Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement is the first international agreement of this magnitude to be reached before commercial fishing takes place in the high seas. I was proud to serve as minister when this agreement came into force. It's also the first time that an international fishery agreement calls for the signatories to take into account the interests of Indigenous people, and it does so for a very good reason. As the Arctic continues to change, we need to ensure that its vital ecosystems are protected by working together and drawing upon traditional knowledge of the Arctic Indigenous peoples. We are helping to protect the Arctic's diverse and dynamic ecosystems for future generations. From Canada's perspective, the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and participation of Indigenous representation in meetings will be critical to the agreement's overall success. This is just one example of how Canada stands committed to meaningful participation of Arctic communities, including Indigenous peoples, in the ongoing implementation of this agreement and its other priorities for the Arctic. This position reflects the government's commitment to advancing reconciliation and pursuing a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples that's based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. New opportunities and challenges are emerging across the Arctic, in part due to the impacts of climate change. The North is seeing the impacts of climate change faster than anywhere else in Canada. Alarmingly, the circumpolar Arctic is experiencing warming at rates roughly 3 times higher than the global average. This can lead to many new challenges, but also to the potential for the North as a growing interest to Canada and other Arctic states, and increasingly to others from beyond the region. While the opportunities are great, there are also important social, economic, and environmental challenges. This global context is why amplifying the voices of Arctic Indigenous people in research is absolutely essential. I'm grateful to Dr. Lavoie for her work to educate the research community on this topic, and to Dartmouth College for prioritizing this approach. Your work helps governments make better decisions that benefit all of us. Thank you. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to the presentation.
It's always wonderful when a speaker says everything you hoped would be said, and I have now quotes that I can say. The Honorable Bernadette Jordan, Consul General to the U.S. from Boston, said from Canada. So thank you very much. And that, I think I'm going to just quickly give you a little heads up about our distinguished Canada Fulbright visiting chair in Arctic Studies here this year. Our 2024 chair is as you've heard, Dr. Josée Lavoie, who is an internationally renowned researcher with over 30 years of experience working in partnership with Indigenous communities and organizations to improve Indigenous people's access to health services. She is a professor of community health sciences at the University of Manitoba with the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences and former director of the Ongomiizwin Research in the Indigenous Institute of Research in the Indigenous Institute of Health and Healing. Her scholarship focuses on improving access to primary health care for underserved and marginalized populations. She also studies health systems policy at the local, regional, and national level and has already joined several classes here at Dartmouth on health equity, global health, and our students are raving about what she's brought to those courses. She has a particular interest in how Western Indigenous knowledge systems interface in the provision of health services and in and for Indigenous communities in the Arctic and around the world. And in 2018, she served as she was chosen actually, as a Fulbright Arctic Initiative Scholar working on policy-relevant research with and for Arctic communities with an international cohort of scholars and Indigenous knowledge holders from throughout the circumpolar north. Since that work, she has also developed a strong interest in both Arctic Indigenous peoples' governance, which we were just hearing about, and circumpolar diplomacy that includes the voices and the sovereign rights of Indigenous peoples. Her research partners often include First Nations, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples across Canada, in Alaska, Norway, Colombia, Australia, and New Zealand, and she maintains ongoing research partnerships with the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat in Manitoba and the Manitoba Inuit Association. She received her Bachelor's of Sciences from McGill, her Master's of Arts in Medical Anthropology from McGill as well, and her PhD in Health Policy and Financing from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She has not only been a Fulbright Scholar, Fulbright Arctic Initiative Scholar, but also was nominated for awards at the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences and is a fellow in the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce her on behalf of the Institute of Arctic Studies in the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding and our co-sponsors at the Center for Global Health Equity in the Geisel School of Medicine, Dr. Josée Lavoie.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the gift of your time. I'm really excited to be here, and I hope that my presentation will stimulate some conversation. I hope to do a shorter presentation, have time for discussion afterwards. There's three stories that I'm going to be weaving together. One is a very personal story, which is kind of my starting point. A second one was work that I did as part of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, which is a international, cross-national comparison of ethical guidelines for engaging with Indigenous nations. And a third one is how I, through my program of research, have internalized and operationalized expectation within the Canadian context. And then we'll come to some conclusions. So the beginning, this is me circa 1991, a little younger than I am now. So I'm in Montreal. It's 1990, it's July. And if you know July, I assume that you have the same kind of weather. It's 38 degrees in my apartment. I don't have aircon, so that means 100 degrees in Fahrenheit. I have to look it up. I'm sitting at my desk, and it's humid, because Montreal is very humid in the summer. There's a pile of transcript next to me that are, I think there's a little bit of echo here, that are basically transcript of fieldwork that I did in Inuit communities in northern Quebec, in Nunavik. And I'm reading those transcripts and I'm trying to ascribe meaning to what I have studied, which is how Inuit are integrating Inuit knowledge into this newly created healthcare system under the governance of an Inuit health board in Nunavik. This health board was created as a result of a land claim agreement, and I'm trying to see whether this is the Quebec healthcare system that I know very well, or whether there's something different values organizing this work. And I'm reading transcript, and in hindsight, what I'm going through is what every master's student, honor students I've ever supervised since are going through, but I don't know that yet. I'm going through the angst of trying to ascribe meaning to data, trying to honor voices, trying to really deeply understand what was shared with me. And it's not working. So I do what every student does in this context. I procrastinate. And I go to the Globe and Mail, which is one of our national paper, and I open it to the classified because I know very well that I'm going to be running out of money pretty soon, and this is not progressing very fast. And I see it. I see the advertisement. It's for a health promotion officer position in Rankin Inlet, then part of the Northwest Territory, now part of Nunavut. And it's perfect. I have a bachelor's in nutrition, a master's in medical anthropology, AB. The thesis is not done. And I think I can do this. I think this would be perfect because it won't be on this side of the Hudson Bay where I did my field work. It's always a mistake because you keep on gathering data if you go back to the same place. It's on the other side. Brand new context, but similarity, and also a newly created Inuit Health Board. It's perfect. I apply. And this is how I find myself in Rankin Inlet, that photo, in 1990, in October, in pouring rain, sleet, cold, wondering, why was this a good idea? I'm charged, this is the first time they have that position. It's a brand new position. My job is to create a health promotion strategy for the 8 communities that I'm charged to cover. And I'm trained in anthropology. My first thought is, got to work with communities, right? So I start working with the Inuit health committees that exist in each of the community, and one of that member has a seat on the health board. So there's that connection, and asking those committees, what are your priorities? How do you see us advancing those priorities from a community perspective? So I'm doing that community development work that I love. And then when I'm not traveling, then I'm reading the literature. And I get frustrated. Because what communities are telling me about, they're telling me about food insecurity. They're telling me about 20 people in a house that was planned for a family of 6. They're telling me about unsafe water. They're telling me about contamination. They're telling me about the cost of gas and how when they used to hunt with dogs, well, you could feed the dog with what you hunted and it was a self-sustaining system. But the cost of gas is basically prohibitive for many families. They're telling me about systemic issues. What I'm reading in the literature is we need to provide more education to Inuit. If Inuit only know what to eat, they would eat better and they would be healthier. If they only knew not to smoke, they would not smoke. We need to educate it more. And it's 1990, let's be nice. It's a long time ago, but yet it's not that long ago because that still happens. And so I'm reading icons in public health in Canada that are writing this, and I'm not seeing the connection with the reality that I'm seeing through the health committees. And increasingly I realize that you cannot do this work sitting in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, or wherever you are, decontextualize. You cannot do analysis of data from a decontextualized perspective because invariably what comes through is assumptions. and my assumption of how the world works and what are the reasons for what people experience in their life is based on my reality, not an Inuit reality. So that's my beginning. So, of course, I was not the only one that was frustrated with Southern-based research on Inuit that created decontextualized analysis. First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, the Indigenous people of Canada, had long requested, pushed for, advocated for the nothing about us without us principle. And so this was heard by one of our national funder, the Canadian Institute for Health Research. And in 2005, I will call it CIHR, Canadian Institute for Health Research, CIHR commissioned a group of Indigenous scholars, elder knowledge keepers, to go around the country and spend 2 years talking to community to say, what do you want in terms of ethical principle to set expectation on researchers that we will then promote and enforce. And so the first series of guidelines were adopted in 2007. They were revised in 2012 to include, to extending the expectation of engagement. And then in 2018, those particular guidelines became embedded in the peer review process. That means that we pass from expectation after funding to expectation as a requirement for funding. So it's not a letter of support, it's much more extensive than that. And if you turn the tap off for researcher to access money, it's funny how you can transform the academy. And so we've moved from communities voicing how they want research to be done to a system now where Indigenous communities define whether they will engage with the researchers and the conditions under which they will engage. So moving forward, I had the privilege to be involved with the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, and these were my peeps. We got t-shirts, it's official. And you'll recognize some of the names. Gwen Healy has been here many times, and Christina, we were just talking about Christina. And what we decided to do, I like to do those when I have time, to do those large cross-national analysis to give me a sense of positioning where Canada is in the midst of debates and see what we can learn from elsewhere and vice versa. And so we're producing analysis of ethical guidelines across circumpolar countries. And this is the analysis that, this is just to represent, but I'm speaking to the converted, how diverse Indigenous communities are across the circumpolar world. So there's not a single approach that will suit everybody. It has to be defined by communities. And this is where we landed on the analysis at the time. I've checked. There's still no guidelines yet adopted in Greenland. It's still under construction, but it's happening. There's guidelines being developed by Sami in Norway as well, but they're not quite landed yet. So of all of the countries, of course, Iceland was not included. They don't have an Indigenous population. We were able to identify, 3 sets of guidelines. And there's 4 broad principles. It's more extensive in the paper, but look at consultation in the research protocol, so in the creation of the research, community involvement in the conduct of the research, looking at access to data and samples by the community, and then the dissemination. And the Canadian guidelines are quite explicit and extensive. Norway has, because Samis are picked up on a number of different points, their guidelines are more about biological research or samples, where ours are more, it includes social science as well. Now, I don't want to embarrass the my American colleagues here. There's no animation, so they're not coming. There is nothing in that column, basically because there is a different model here. And the model is that it's embedded in the guidelines that protocols created by the tribes must be abided by. which is a recognition for self-governance, self-determination, which is neither good nor bad. It is there. The concern that I have is that if you have communities with different capacity, you do not create a baseline of expectations. There's also the issue of if you leave it at the implementation level, it cannot inform peer review to the same extent. And so it's a different model that respects self-government. There's validity to that, but I think there are some limitations. When the guidelines were adopted in Canada, many researchers gasped, and some exited the space entirely because the benchmark was too high for them or too different or too foreign to them. But I've embraced them because I came from community and I had spent 10 years in Nunavut, but also before that in First Nation communities. And to me, the idea of working with community was the only logical way. And so what I'm going to be speaking now on is how I have operationalized ethical guidelines within my own program of research, and I'll be speaking to the Ongomiizwin program of research implemented since 2016 with Inuit who live in Manitoba and who live in the Kivalik region where I used to work of Nunavut. So this study emerged from a discussion with Wayne Clark, and now Dr. Wayne Clark. He was a PhD candidate at the time and the president of the Manitoba Inuit Association, who approached me and said, basically, University of Manitoba had been able to do detailed profiles of health service utilization for First Nation. And for Métis in the past, we are quite unique in Manitoba. We have administrative data that is linkable to identity, and that is linkable across sectors. So we can link data that is health, justice, social, educational attainment, social housing, and so on, and being able to create detailed profile of service utilization and assess where investment are required. Our government supports that, and it's basically entrenched as a research unit, the Manitoba Center for Health Policy at the University of Manitoba, and that's one of the reasons why I am in Manitoba, because that does not exist anywhere in the world. This is the best place to do this research. And so Wayne approached me and said, we need that for Inuit, and one of the limitations, it had never been done, and mechanisms that had been used for Métis and First Nation were not available. So it took us about a year to figure out, after a lot of bouncing back and forth, on how to create an algorithm that would identify Inuit in the administrative data. And then we started creating those profiles, with the idea of creating those profiles of service utilization. So it was driven by the Manitoba Inuit Association to basically meet their needs. So give a little bit of context to the Canadian context. Basically, Canadian Constitution recognized Indigenous right under Section 35 for 3 groups, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. We now have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is now law in Canada, so that basically creates a whole series of obligations that our current government is working on further defining and implementing. Indigenous rights in Canada are portable, so 50% of Inuit in Nunavut, which is basically, I'm not sure that this works. The laser, the northern part of Canada, you have the Inuvialuit, Nunavut, Nunavik, and Nunatsiavut in Labrador. That's the Inuit traditional territory. 50% of Inuit live outside of Nunavut. And so that means that they have rights, but operationalizing those rights is more difficult. It's a small population. But yet we have that obligation. We have to meet that obligation. And our Canadian healthcare system is a single payer, so that creates also cross-jurisdictional obligations that have to be met. And we have 10 provinces, 3 territories, so that's 13 healthcare systems plus a federal one that cross all of those jurisdictions, just to keep things simple. So in Winnipeg is a point of service for the Kivalik, which is where I used to work. And so we have about 16,000 consult per year by Inuit, which for scale, it's a province of 1.2 million people. So you're going to have about 3 million consult a year minimum, just to guess. 16,000 is not exactly remarkable from a numerical standpoint. And there we were able to identify 1,500 plus Inuit living in Manitoba. That's another representation because of our algorithm is imperfect. We started working with knowledge keepers, elders. Nukalak is the former Minister of Health for Nunavut, and she was on the board of director of the board when I worked there. Michael Kusugak is a very well-known children book writer. He's got over 30 books written. He's world-renowned. We started working with them after the funding came. And one of the issue of community engagement is that presumably they should have been involved at the onset. It was a strategic decision because there is something about raising expectations and then sending your proposal to the funder. It takes 9 months to cook and until you get to know, and raising those expectations with knowledge keepers and then coming back and say, sorry, we didn't get funded. It's a lot of investment on their part into a maybe. And so we waited until we got the funding. There's also the issue of having funding to engage them appropriately. Nukalak lives in Rankin Inlet. Tagak lives outside of Winnipeg. Bringing people together takes resources. So for that reason, we waited. As for the helpers, Wayne joined, that's me. We have an epidemiologist, a mental health professionals, a member for the Manitoba Inuit Association. Trainees, these are the PhDs and the postdocs that are working with us. We have a number of undergraduate students that have always worked with us. It's just a few of the trainees that we have. So our large team, very cross-sectorial in terms of research, because the question that we ask are coming from the community and they don't stick to a discipline. So the principle of consultation in the development of research, of course, it was done in consultation with the Manitoba Inuit Association. We took that one step further in that the first task that we had was to come together and say, how are we going to work together? Some of those elders, Tagak in particular, thought that she had nothing to contribute because she used to be a heavy equipment operator, fluent in Inuktitut, very much grounded in her knowledge. She's the one always stepping up and saying, well, that's not what we think. But she thought that she had nothing to contribute. Now she chairs the meetings. Grace spent most of her time in the South, so she knows very much what it is to be an Inuk in the South, but felt that she was never Inuk enough, right, at the beginning. So we were able to support that and change that. And we started talking about the objective, what we had cooked up in the proposal, and what they thought would be more important. And we started to have those discussions to come to consensus. We talked about how the decision-making process would take place. We talked about conflict resolution. We've never had to use that particular clause. We talked about processes for meetings. What did they want for minutes of meeting? What was the format? Well, they didn't want something that was very succinct. They wanted the full transcript plus a summary, so like an executive summary of minutes. That's what they want for transparency. We talked about authorship because the knowledge that is given is their knowledge. And basically for me, if I'm going to be writing an article as, the grunt, the person that does the hard lifting work, I still need to go back to the elders and say, what do you think? And we've done multiple drafts of where we're not quite getting it right. And so they are all co-authors on our paper and talked about remuneration as well. And so this is a living document. It's never going to be quite finished. And we are now 2016-24 in our 8 years of operation working together. The principle of data ownership. Because we are using administrative data that is owned by the government, I cannot give that data to the community, right? But there is qualitative data also being collected. And at some point, the Manitoba Inuit Association, who is setting up its own infrastructure for data holding, may want that data back. Or they may not, because it may just take space, and they may want the university to host it. And so those are discussions that we're having as to who owns the data, what are the conditions under which you can access this data. The algorithm that we created during COVID became actually quite critical, because what Manitoba Inuit Association asked us is, how can we know what's happening to our community so we can advocate for more services, for more funding. And so as a result of the algorithm and happenstance, I was at the decision-making table with the provincial government and said, well, we can identify Inuit. First Nation were saying, can we have those report every week so we know what's happening to our community? And I said, well, Inuit can do that as well. And we were able to get those reports. I'm not sure about the format. I find it quite crowded, but I did not design it. But it is the number of people tested, number of people positive, number of people hospitalized in ICU, number of deaths. And when vaccination became available, the number of vaccine, the longer report will tell me whether it's Moderna, Pfizer, it's there, but it's in more detail, and the number of shots. And so as a result of that report, the association was able to say to government, well, we have food insecurity, we have all those conditions, we need pop-up vaccination. Our provincial government was saying we need to prioritize First Nation for vaccination, and that's evidence-based. We were able to include Inuit for the first time under the same label of vulnerability and priority. But because governments think in terms of silos, they were saying, well, you can only vaccinate Inuit. And the Manitoba Inuit Association was saying, no, you need to actually vaccinate families. And Inuit families include Filipinos, Francophones, and so on and so forth. So by being family-centric, which is a value, they were able to have a broader reach. The algorithm created can only be accessible with permission from the Manitoba Inuit Association, meaning that any other research is coming in and says, I want to do research on Inuit, will have to get through that threshold, and without that permission, that work will not proceed. Principle of community involvement in study and dissemination in publications. One of the first things that we did is we said, well, we don't know the community, and at the time where we started working with the Manitoba Inuit Association, they had 2 staff. That's it, because they had never been recognized as a priority to the provincial government, because they were largely invisible. And the federal government at the time was a different government and somewhat the less friendly government to Indigenous people. So we knew the community was not coming together. We had a sense that it was quite fractured. And so we started hosting feasts. And one of the first things that we did with our funding was to basically purchase some traditional food, bring people together, and have maybe 10 minutes when we talk about our work, but mostly we spend time just getting to know people and bringing them together as a community. Just as a gathering. From those gatherings, I can't say that we were more popular than the food, to be quite honest. So I'm not sure how many people from those gatherings would remember. They would know me, but they would not know what we were doing. And in a sense, that's quite okay. They have their own priorities. When we started doing more data analysis, which is EPI, right? So statistics, it's rates per thousands and so on and so forth, stuff I get excited about, but that others may find quite boring. We had to learn how to present that data to the elders. And some of our elders, like Nukalak, former Minister of Health, no problem. Others were quite intimidated by that, and we had to work through multiple presentation of the same information and then hear the stories that they were reporting back and try to see whether the stories actually mesh with what we were understanding of the data. And when it didn't, and when they took us in a different direction, we'd go back to the analysis and say, what did we miss? What did we not get? And so when we came to papers, well, first we started with fact sheets, because fact sheets can be produced in an hour or two. Papers take a couple of years to be published, and understanding strategically that the organization may want the data right away, that was the way to vet the data in a one page from an organizational perspective, and if that resonated, then we could produce papers. So it was a multi-stage process where at the end of the day, when authorship came to play in, there was a level of comfort. Everybody knew what was in a paper and could sign off. And so that's how we met those particular obligations. So what impact is always difficult to gauge, because when you change policies, policy writers don't cite research. It's unfortunate. That would be helpful. But what we were able to achieve is greater visibility for the organization. They now have 24 staff and growing from 2, so that's exciting. And in 2021, the government of Manitoba first recognized its responsibility towards Inuit in the land acknowledgement at the Legislative Assembly before any session begins. They are included along with First Nation and Métis. There was also an apology by the Manitoba College of Physician and Surgeon in recognition of systemic and interpersonal racism in the healthcare system and a promise to do better. And now there's an implementation plan to try to address that. The expansion, the epidemiological profile that we created had quite an impact in terms of access to funding. So we did this, they did this, but those pieces were informed by our work as well. It was easier to advocate to government with data. Greater connection, now the organization is engaged in research on housing, child protection, culturally safe birthing, and there's 2 more projects with us. So we're continuing our relationship, but their networking with the research community is expanding. And the capacity has been exponential within our team and within the Manitoba Inuit Association. So I'm confident that we've played a small role. We are, I like to say, a hugs and kisses type of relationship where we meet as friends and we can have difficult conversation in a collegial way and find ways forward. So in conclusion, what I value is transformative research. I recognize the value of discovery research. They both have their place, but what I'm committed to is transformative research. And that means involving humans. And if humans, if government, if organizations are going to be benefiting from the data, they have to buy into the data and they have to know where it came from. There are also organizations sit at tables where I'll never be invited. And so they are agents of transformation with the information that is produced through research. Basically, community engagement is the only way to move forward for transformation. Inclusion means better science. It means that what I read in 1990 in public health publication by icons in my country will not be replicated by my team, because the data resonate with the community. And so we can put to rest a whole millions of dollars worth of research that was decontextualized and produce something that is actually more applicable and has more immediate benefit. Funders and communities co-developing ethical guidelines can actually orchestrate a change in culture within the academy. And I saw it as in my role as the director of Ongomiizwin Research, a center that I led for 10 years, where researchers would come to me and say, well, for some would say, can you give me access to the data? And I would say no, and they would go away, and that's how it would end. But in other cases where, especially with newer researchers saying, I want to do this well, as a non-Indigenous person, and for myself as a non-Indigenous person, I can help them work through their anxieties to find the right language and develop the relationship. So my question, perhaps to start the conversation, is there's a lack of national direction in the U.S., and I'm wondering whether that's an opportunity. Because for us, the transformation was led by Indigenous researchers that were affiliated with Canadian Institute for Health Research. The NIH does not have guidelines. And I've been wondering whether perhaps a conversation with Indigenous scholars across the countries and Indigenous leaders could start creating a position paper that might give you an infrastructure to further advance self-determination in research and advance the quality of the science that is informing policy. So I'm going to leave you with that question. So that's my question to you. But I'm happy to answer yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lavoie. And I'm going to stand over here and help take questions. I have many of my own, but with this prompt, does anyone want to follow up, or does anyone have another question? Oh, Dawn Carey, Global Health, Associate Director of Global Health in the Dickey Center, who might have a thought on this.
I can't fix it, I'm afraid, but I do have a answering question, if that makes sense. So in the United States, there is a perception of Indian Health Service, which is also a single payer, of being, in some parts of the country, an actual lesser product than the third-party insurance payment hospital systems. And I don't know what level of data would change that. There are other political elements in that. Did you find prior to including this Indigenous-led research, that same perception in Canada? And if so, is some of the research actually changing the perception of the folks who are going to these hospitals, these native hospitals, to liking their system better, if that makes sense on some level?
Yes, it does, but I'm going to go back to that slide because I need to explain the Canadian healthcare system. So basically, okay, so single payer distributed across 10 provinces and 3 territories. So they are the payers of hospitals and family physician and specialist. Those are accessed at no out-of-pocket cost to the individual, whether you are First Nation, Métis, Inuit, or non-Indigenous. We all have access, presumably, to the same healthcare system. Sadly, racism does, throw a wrench in that. So I'm just going to take a tissue. But presumably, we're supposed to all have equitable access to those services. Where we have UIFDIHS, ours is the First Nation and Inuit Health Branch of Health Canada, now of Indigenous Services Canada, sorry, they shifted it. That is the 14 healthcare system. And so that system operates in all communities, the 609 First Nation communities, plus this is the system that was set up in Northern Quebec, in Nunavut, and also across the territory. It is more of a health center, nursing station type of system. It is a nursing-centric system. And so it's manned by nurses with an expanded scope of practice. They are federally funded. About 89% of First Nations manage those services, not necessarily the nurses. Many of them stay with the federal government for very long reasons that I can get into if you really want me to. But in terms of those point of cares, they are distributed. So every reserve would have a point of care that is federally funded. And it's mostly primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention in more isolated communities. Then there's a nurse with an expanded scope of practice, and they will do some primary care. In terms of your question, I was able to, with my team, in 2010, that was one of the first study that I did using health administrative data, showing that in Manitoba and in British Columbia, communities that manage their own healthcare system as opposed to the federal government being a direct provider of those services had better outcomes. They had a lower rate of hospitalization for conditions that are treatable in primary care. And that comes from some of our context, which is that when it's managed by the federal government, you have access to, primary care or primary prevention, and then if you go off reserve, then you access the provincial healthcare system. Well, the federal-provincial relationship are not always very collegial. But when it's managed by First Nation who have relationship with maybe their cousin that's on the board of the hospital, then it's much easier to have more integration of services. So that's one of the factors. Plus, when it's managed by your community and auntie has not come to go food shopping in 3 days, well, let's go check up on auntie. It's much more relational. So those are the two factors, but it was correlated with also increase in life expectancy. So communities that have community controls do much better. So, and that's empirical. That's with avoidable hospitalization rates. So, and I'm very pleased that we were the first one to show it. Does that answer your question?
I have 100 questions attached to it. I'm going to let others ask.
Okay, Bruce.
I see a question. Thank you. I see a question from Dr. Bruce Dutu.
I have a question. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for joining us today. I had a question about definition of
Sure.
How does Canada define an Indigenous person in the U.S.? That is a very complicated issue. We have, in response to your last slide, innumerable obstacles that serve as barriers to efficient healthcare delivery in the U.S., as well as the study of the system itself. We have 574 federally recognized tribal nations scattered throughout the U.S. That includes 220 plus in Alaska. But the majority of the U.S. Indigenous population doesn't live in those communities. It's heavily urban. And when you look at that slide right there that says Indigenous rights are portable, that's not necessarily the case here in the U.S. because for many folks, the services are at their reservation. If they're enrolled citizens, it's not necessarily portable, but it's also a funding issue. There's a tremendous gap in the funding for urban healthcare for Native societies. And so it's really a fraction, even though that's where most of the Natives live, it's a fraction of the healthcare allocations that the Indian Health Service has. I show my students a slide in one of my courses that says when you're looking at per capita payments of U.S. healthcare in those systems that are federal healthcare systems, the per capita expenditures for federal inmates is higher than what the U.S. spends for Indigenous healthcare.
Okay, so
that's a very sad commentary about how poorly resourced the Indian healthcare system here is in the U.S. So back to my question is on definitions of Indigenous. What?
Okay, so there's going to be so Inuit self-identify. There is no list of Inuit per se. There is no algorithm or blood quantum discussion we were having this morning. For First Nation, it's different for historical reasons. So until 1985, a First Nation woman who married a non-Indigenous man lost her status, and the kids were non-status. And the reverse was true. If you were an Indian man marrying a white woman, she would become an Indian. And the kids would be First Nations. That was addressed in 1982 as a result of the charter, because discrimination on the basis of sex and gender. And so a number of women and children who lost their status came back in. But it became problematic in the sense that the act that defines identity is called the Indian Act. And the Indian Act, Article 6, is the one that speaks to identity. Those who never lost their status were called 6-1. And people will say, oh yeah, I'm a 6-1, I'm a 6-2. So there's 6-1, and those who regain their status are 6-2. Now follow me, this is going to hurt a little bit. 6-1 has a child with 6-1, the child is 6-1. 6-1 has a child with 6-2, the child is 6-1. 6-2 has a child with 6-2, the child is 6-2. 6-2 has a child with non-state status, and the child is non-status. Now, non-status may include a First Nation person who lost their status out of that rigmarole. And so that's Canada. Welcome. Sometimes I say we look better on paper. I apologize, but that's true. We punch high as a nation. Sometimes we don't quite meet our standard. Métis right now is a big, complicated conversation. The Métis are an indigenous culture that came out of mixed ancestry between French, Cree, Ojibwe people, Scottish as well. But they created their own language, culture, and they live as a distinct nation. They're recognized in the Constitution. Right now, the National Métis Council speaks to the right of people of mixed ancestry to call themselves Métis. The Manitoba Métis Federation has declared that they're the only authentic Métis are the Red River Métis out of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and that they're the only one that can call themselves Métis in Canada, and the fight is on. And so I'm not sure where that's going to land, but Métis were never recognized as an Indigenous people until 1982, and as a result of it, they access their services without the benefit of federal investment. So they access exactly the same services as I have. There's a Supreme Court decision, the Daniels decision, that basically has recognized that Métis have Indigenous rights and that they should be under the same policies of the federal government. That has yet to be reflected in policy. And so it's only 10 years old, so I guess it's coming. And so that's the very complicated version. And out of all of this, there's also the non-status First Nation who are culturally First Nation, may live adjacent to a reserve, and for historical reason lost their status. And they are Indigenous culturally by virtue of lineage and ancestry, but they're not recognized federally. And so if you think it's messy here, it's messy up here, up in Canada as well.
Thank you. And as we see if there's another question, I will say that if it's odd, that actually gives me even more hope, that answer, because it isn't perfect, and yet there's a leadership role in the structural mandates that have come from the government that still set a bar that everyone's trying to meet, and that's something that I think, and I don't know whether Dartmouth shouldn't. Even if it could, it can't do it alone. It has to be pushing for those kinds of broader systemic changes, which, I'm somewhat hopeful with people. Some of the folks in this room, I won't name names, think how important these kinds of conversations are. So I'm not going to take that off the table. So I like that you put that as a challenge of discussion, and I think it's very important as we think about the future of what we do, and how we can do some changes. This actually happened. I was just up in Iqaluit not too long ago. We were talking about it, and so many people in Iqaluit trying to take on how do we make sure that Western researchers check in? They're supposed to, but it was up, and this was the challenge. It was up to each community. Were they going to police research, or is there some, again, looking at the systems, is there an investment, is there a funding to support the enforcement of people working together, or better yet, the education that you just couldn't work, you wouldn't think to do research without partnering with a community, with an Indigenous community and with knowledge holders. You wouldn't think to publish without having all of these conversations. And that is a cultural change that I do think there are small beacons that can start putting that into our daily lives that can be a ripple effect, as one of my great colleagues in the back, Don Carey, just talked about recently, that actually makes waves. So I appreciate the push. I was going to ask you on that front, what would you see a place like Dartmouth in health or in broad research, some steps we could take, and I will say as the non-Indigenous, not putting the burden on Indigenous peoples, as non-Indigenous researchers with the privilege of being here, what are some first steps, and this is a big question, but we might take to help make those ripples? What is it? How do we work? Do we work with local communities? Should we outreach to Arctic communities? What would you say is best for our researchers? How do we support them in trying to be part of the change?
Well, thank you for your trust in that big question. There's a couple of ways I think you can go. One is you are in a territory, and so there's obligation to that territory as a guest in Abenaki territory to go to the leadership and start engaging with that leadership for guidance. But of course, that leadership cannot speak to what's happening with UPIC, right? So it's community-centric. And so another dimension of the solution could be to work with your research ethics board and to set up principles by which you expect the Dartmouth community to abide to. So you could set up your own guidelines, and that could become a template. It could be co-created if you can map out the different communities that researchers are engaged with and have a conversation. I was going to say hui, basically the Maori word, have a conversation with those communities to say, so researchers are working with you. What are some of the principles that you would like as a beginning of that conversation? So rather than having a national approach, which is perhaps a little bit more difficult, to start obligating the Dartmouth communities and creating awareness to have different starting point for those research relationships. Helpful?
That is absolutely helpful. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? No? All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here. Thank you online. Thanks to our speaker, Dr. Josée Lavoie, who is here through the end of May at Dartmouth in just an office upstairs if you want to say hello. And my thanks, so many thanks to the Honorable Bernadette Jordan, Consul General to the U.S. in Boston from Canada, and Michael Pizzaveri for coming up here as well and honoring us with the presence for the 2024 Fulbright Canada Visiting Chair in Arctic Studies lecture. Thank you again.
My pleasure.